I'm too old for love," she whispered, her weathered hands trembling as she pushed him away from the cabin door. Apache's dark eyes never left her face. "I've waited my whole life," he said simply, his voice carrying decades of loneliness across the dusty threshold. "Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, neither willing to step back, neither able to move forward. But how had they arrived at this moment? How had a half-breed tracker and a widowed schoolteacher found themselves standing on the precipice of something that could destroy them both? Let me take you back to where it all began, 3 months earlier, when Martha Sinclair arrived in the godforsaken town of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a heart she'd sworn was buried with her husband. The stagecoach had deposited her in a cloud of red dust and broken dreams. At 42, Martha had gray threading through her auburn hair and lines around her green eyes that spoke of too much sorrow packed into too few years. The other passengers, a traveling salesman and a young woman heading to her wedding, had made polite conversation about the territory's opportunities, but Martha knew the truth. She was running from the creditors who'd taken her Boston home, running from the memories that haunted every familiar street, running from well-meaning friends who insisted it was time she moved on from Thomas's death, as if love was something you could pack away like winter clothes when the season changed. Copper Ridge looked exactly like what it was, the last stop before nowhere. False-fronted buildings lined a single dusty street, their paint peeling like old wounds in the desert sun. The hotel sign creaked in the wind, advertising clean beds and hot meals in faded letters that suggested both claims were generous exaggerations. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, a small wooden structure that might have been whitewashed once upon a time. Now it wore the same sun-bleached gray as everything else in this forgotten corner of the world. But it was hers, or would be, for as long as the town council deemed her services necessary. That first night, as Martha unpacked her few belongings in the cramped room above Henderson's general store, she'd made herself a promise. No more dreams. No more hoping for something beyond survival. She would teach the children, earn her keep, and exist quietly until God saw fit to reunite her with Thomas. She had no way of knowing that a pair of dark eyes was already watching her from the shadows, or that her carefully constructed walls were about to meet their match in a man who understood loneliness better than anyone. The Apache tracker watched her every morning from the ridge above town, and Martha Sinclair pretended not to notice. He sat motionless on his paint horse, a dark silhouette against the dawn sky, as she walked to the schoolhouse with her worn leather book satchel clutched tight. The townspeople had whispered warnings about him from her first day. Half-breed, they called him, as if the word itself was poison, dangerous, not to be trusted. But when Martha looked up at that ridge, she saw something else entirely. Loneliness. It recognized its own, she supposed. "Miss Sinclair," young Timothy Garrett called out as she opened the schoolhouse door. "My pa says that Indian up there is watching you particular-like. Says we ought to tell Sheriff Morrison." Martha set her satchel on the rough-hewn desk and turned to face her 8 students, children ranging from 6 to 14, their faces reflecting the hard life of the territory. Good children, hungry for learning in a place where books were scarce as rainfall. "His name is Apache Joe," she said calmly, lighting the oil lamp. "And last I checked, a man sitting on public land wasn't a crime, even in Arizona territory." "But Miss Sinclair," Little Mary Henderson piped up, her blue eyes wide with worry. Ma says Indians steal white women. Says they. That's enough. Martha's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. We're here to learn reading and arithmetic, not spread foolish gossip. Open your primers to page 12. But even as she taught the children their letters and numbers, Martha found her gaze drifting to the window. The figure on the ridge never moved, never approached, just watched with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. It should have frightened her. Any sensible woman would have marched straight to the sheriff's office and demanded protection. Instead, Martha found herself curious about the lonely watcher who kept his vigil each dawn, disappearing only when the sun climbed high enough to bake the desert floor. 3 weeks passed this way. Then came the morning young Sally Morrison didn't show up for school. She was walking here same as always. Her father, Sheriff Dan Morrison, explained to Martha after the other children had been dismissed. Johnny Walsh saw her on Main Street around 7:30. Then nothing, like she just vanished into thin air. Martha's blood ran cold. Sally was only 10, a bright child with her mother's blonde curls and a smile that could light up the dreariest day. How long has she been missing? Since yesterday morning. We've searched every building in town, sent men out to check the mines and water holes. Nothing. The sheriff's face was gray with exhaustion and fear. I hate to ask, Miss Sinclair, but that tracker, Apache Joe, he's got skills none of us possess. He could find sign where we can't. You want me to ask him for help? Morrison nodded grimly. Folks won't like it, but Sally's my only child. I'll make a deal with the devil himself if it brings her home safe. The next morning, Martha climbed the ridge. She found Apache Joe exactly where she expected, sitting motionless beside a stunted juniper tree, his dark eyes fixed on the valley below. Up close, he was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 35, with strong features that spoke of both white and Apache heritage. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and he wore simple ranch clothes that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Dark as midnight, and filled with a depth of sadness that matched her own. Sheriff Morrison sent me, Martha said without preamble, clutching her shawl against the morning wind. A child is missing, Sally Morrison, 10 years old, blonde hair. She disappeared yesterday morning. Apache Joe studied her for a long moment, then dismounted his horse with fluid grace. You are the school teacher. His voice was deep, carefully modulated, with only the slightest accent. Martha realized she'd expected broken English, the stereotypical heap-big speech the dime novels always portrayed. Instead, this man spoke like an educated person who'd simply chosen his words with care. I am, and you are Apache Joe, though I suspect that's not your given name. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his features. Joseph Crow Feather. My father was a cavalry officer, my mother Apache. The town finds it easier to just call me Apache Joe. And what do you prefer to be called? Most people don't ask. He tilted his head, studying her with those penetrating dark eyes. You are different from what I expected. Because I'm not running away screaming about savage Indians? Now he did smile, a real one that transformed his entire face. Something like that. You said a child is missing. Tell me what you know. Martha related everything Sheriff Morrison had told her, watching as Apache Joe, Joseph, listened with complete attention. When she finished, he nodded once. I will track her, he said simply. But I work alone. The sheriff and his men will only trample any sign that remains. I'll make sure they understand. Joseph was already moving toward his horse when Martha called after him. Why? Why are you willing to help when the town treats you like an outcast?" He paused, one hand on his horse's neck. "Because a child's life matters more than their parents' ignorance, and because—" He met her eyes across the distance. "You asked me instead of demanding. You spoke to me like I was human. That has been a rare experience in Copper Ridge." Something in his tone made Martha's heart clench. "How long have you been living out here alone?" 3 years. Since my mother's people decided I was too white, and the white settlers decided I was too Apache." Joseph swung up into his saddle with easy grace. "I will find the child, Miss Sinclair, but I'll need to follow the trail quickly before the wind erases it completely." He rode off without another word, leaving Martha standing alone on the ridge with a dozen questions burning in her throat. By afternoon, word had spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire that the schoolteacher had sought out the half-breed tracker. Some praised her desperation to find Sally. Others whispered darker things about a widow woman seeking company with a savage. Martha ignored them all, teaching her remaining students with half her attention, while the other half strained toward the desert, hoping for any sign of Joseph's return. She didn't see him again until sunset, when he rode into town carrying a small, frightened figure wrapped in his jacket. The entire town erupted when Joseph rode down Main Street with Sally Morrison cradled in his arms. Martha pushed through the gathering crowd just as Sheriff Morrison reached his daughter, tears streaming down his weathered face. Sally was dirty and frightened but alive, clinging to her father with desperate relief. "Where did you find her?" Morrison asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Joseph dismounted carefully, his movements precise despite the hostile muttering of the townspeople pressing closer. 2 miles northeast, in the old Spanish mine shaft. She'd fallen through rotten planking, couldn't climb out. "Been calling for help since yesterday," Sally whispered against her father's shoulder. "Got so scared when it got dark. Then I heard his horse and he came down with a rope." "Thank God," Morrison breathed, then looked up at Joseph with naked gratitude. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." But not everyone shared the sheriff's sentiment. "Convenient how he knew exactly where to look," sneered Walter Hayes, the bank president. "Almost like he put her there himself." A dangerous stillness settled over Joseph's features. Martha felt something cold unfurl in her stomach as she watched the crowd's mood shift, gratitude curdling into suspicion. "That's enough, Hayes," Sheriff Morrison snapped. "This man risked his life crawling down that mine shaft. Show some respect." "Respect?" Hayes laughed harshly. "For a half-breed who's been watching our children like a hawk. Wake up, Morrison. This whole thing stinks of a setup." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Martha saw the resignation settle over Joseph's face like a familiar coat, the look of a man accustomed to being blamed for crimes he didn't commit. "You people are incredible," Martha heard herself saying, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip crack. The crowd turned toward her, surprise flickering across hostile faces. A child was lost, and now she's found, alive and unharmed, thanks to this man's tracking skills. And your response is to accuse him of orchestrating the entire thing? "Miss Sinclair," Hayes said with false politeness, "you're new here. You don't understand how these people operate." "These people?" Martha's voice rose, anger burning hot in her chest. "This man has a name, Joseph Crowfeather, and he just saved a 10-year-old girl's life while you stood around pointing fingers." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Hayes wasn't finished. "Pretty words from a widow woman who's been consorting with savages. Makes a man wonder what other services she might be providing." The words died in his throat as Joseph stepped forward, his movement fluid and deadly as a striking snake. "Finish that sentence," he said softly, "and you'll be picking your teeth up off the ground." For a moment, violence hung in the air like summer lightning. Then Sheriff Morrison stepped between them, Sally still in his arms. "That's enough from all of you," he said firmly. "Hayes, keep your filthy suggestions to yourself or spend the night in my jail. The rest of you, go home. The excitement's over." The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves. Hayes shot Martha a look of pure venom before stalking away. Soon only Martha, Joseph, and the Morrison family remained on the darkening street. "Joseph," the sheriff said quietly, "I meant what I said. I owe you. If you ever need anything—" "I need nothing from this town," Joseph replied, but his tone held no anger, only weary acceptance. He looked at Sally, who was peeking at him over her father's shoulder. "You be more careful around old buildings, little one. The desert keeps many secrets, not all of them friendly." Sally nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by reaching out to touch Joseph's hand. "Thank you for saving me. You were very brave." Something flickered in Joseph's dark eyes, surprise, perhaps even the beginning of tears. "You are welcome, Sally Morrison. Now go home to your mother. She has been worried sick." As the Morrison family headed toward their house, Martha found herself alone with Joseph in the gathering dusk. "Thank you," she said simply. "I did nothing you would not have done. I meant for defending me against Hayes's implications." Joseph was quiet for so long that Martha thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "In 3 years, you are the first person in this town to speak to me like I was human, the first to ask my real name. I would not see you shamed for showing basic decency." The raw honesty in his words made Martha's chest tight. "Where will you go now?" "Back to my camp. Back to watching from the ridge." He mounted his horse, looking down at her in the lamplight spilling from Henderson's store. "The people of Copper Ridge have made their feelings clear, but they cannot stop me from making sure their children stay safe." He started to ride away, then paused. "Miss Sinclair, be careful. Hayes is not finished with either of us." 3 days later, Martha discovered exactly what Walter Hayes had in mind when she found a letter slipped under her door. "Miss Sinclair," it read in Hayes's precise handwriting. "Your recent behavior with the half-breed tracker has caused considerable concern among the respectable citizens of Copper Ridge. As president of the school board, I feel obligated to inform you that your continued employment depends upon maintaining appropriate moral standards. Any further association with undesirable elements will result in immediate termination of your contract. Consider this your only warning." Martha crumpled the letter, fury and fear warring in her chest. She needed this job desperately. Without it, she'd have nowhere to go, no way to survive. But the injustice of it burned like acid in her throat. That afternoon, she taught her lessons with forced calm while her mind raced. Several parents had kept their children home, she noticed. The Henderson girl kept shooting her nervous glances, and Timothy Garrett seemed reluctant to meet her eyes. After dismissing the children, Martha sat alone in the empty schoolhouse staring at the evening light filtering through dusty windows. The smart thing would be to avoid Joseph completely, pretend their brief interactions had never happened. Keep her head down, follow Hayes's rules, survive. But survival without dignity wasn't really living at all. The next morning, Joseph wasn't on his usual ridge. Martha told herself it didn't matter, that she hadn't really expected to see him anyway. But as days passed without any sign of the solitary figure, she found herself scanning the horizon with increasing worry. Had Hayes's threats reached him somehow? Had the town's hostility finally driven him away entirely? A week later, she had her answer when she encountered him at Morrison's Creek, the small stream that provided Copper Ridge's water supply. She'd come to wash clothes, seeking the solitude that her room above the store no longer provided. Joseph knelt by the water's edge, refilling his canteens. His horse grazed nearby, and Martha noticed fresh bandages wrapped around his left forearm. "You're hurt," she said without thinking. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "Miss Sinclair, I did not expect to see you here. The ladies of Copper Ridge have made their feelings about my presence quite clear," Martha replied dryly, setting down her wash basket. "I find the creek more welcoming company these days. What happened to your arm?" Joseph glanced at the bandages, then back at her. "Rattlesnake bite. 3 days ago. It is healing." 3 days? Martha moved closer, her teacher's instincts overriding caution. "Have you had proper medical attention? Dr. Kellerman might be a drunk, but he knows how to treat snake bites." Dr. Kellerman made his opinion of treating Indians quite clear when I arrived in Copper Ridge, Joseph said quietly. "I used traditional remedies. They work well enough." The casual acceptance in his voice made Martha's heart ache. "Let me see. Miss Sinclair It's Martha, and let me see the wound." After a moment's hesitation, Joseph began unwrapping the bandages. The snake bite was on his forearm, 2 puncture wounds surrounded by angry red swelling. But what made Martha gasp was the infection clearly setting in around the edges. "This needs proper cleaning and fresh bandages," she said firmly. "You could lose the arm if gangrene sets in. I have no money for a doctor who would refuse to treat me anyway." "Then it's fortunate you know a woman who taught school in Boston, where we learned basic medical care for emergencies." Martha rolled up her sleeves. "I have carbolic acid and clean cloth in my room. Come." Joseph shook his head. "Hayes has already threatened you because of me. If someone sees you treating my wounds, then they'll see a Christian woman helping another human being in need," Martha interrupted, "which used to be considered a virtue, even in God-forsaken places like Copper Ridge." For a long moment, they stared at each other beside the quietly flowing creek. Then Joseph smiled, the real smile she'd seen only once before. "You are a dangerous woman, Martha Sinclair." "I'm a stubborn woman, Joseph Crowfeather. Now stop arguing and let me help you before that infection spreads to your heart." Martha's hands shook only slightly as she cleaned Joseph's wound by lamplight in her small room above Henderson's store. She'd sent him up the back stairs after dark, when the town was settling into sleep and prying eyes were safely shuttered behind closed doors. Now he sat on her single wooden chair while she worked by the light of 2 oil lamps, trying not to think about what would happen if anyone discovered them. "This is going to hurt," she warned, soaking a clean cloth in carbolic acid. "I am accustomed to pain." The quiet acceptance in his voice made her pause. "You shouldn't have to be." When the medicated cloth touched the infected bite, Joseph's jaw tightened, but he made no sound. Martha worked carefully, cleaning away the infected tissue with steady hands that remembered her volunteer work in Boston's Charity Hospital. "Where did you learn medicine?" Joseph asked, his voice strained but controlled. "My husband Thomas was a doctor. I helped him with difficult cases." Martha kept her eyes on her work, not trusting herself to look at his face. "He said I had natural healing hands." He was right. Joseph was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been gone?" 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The words came out before Martha could stop them. "Pneumonia. He caught it treating patients in the Irish district and brought it home." "You loved him very much." It wasn't a question, but Martha answered anyway. "More than life itself. We were married 18 years, and I still felt like a newlywed every morning when I woke up beside him." She finished cleaning the wound and began applying fresh bandages, her movements efficient despite the tremor in her hands. "That's why I came west. I couldn't bear staying in our house, sleeping in our bed, walking streets where his memory lived in every doorway. And yet you speak of him without bitterness." Martha looked up, meeting Joseph's dark eyes. "Why would I be bitter? I had 18 years with the finest man who ever lived. Some people never get even one day of true love. I was blessed beyond measure. Even though it ended in loss, everything ends in loss, Joseph. The question is whether you choose to love anyway. Martha tied off the bandage with careful precision. There. Keep it dry and change the dressing every other day. The infection should clear up within a week. Joseph flexed his arm experimentally, then reached for his shirt. Thank you. I am in your debt. You owe me nothing. I would have done the same for anyone. Martha began cleaning up her supplies, acutely aware of his presence in her small space. Though I admit, I'm curious about something. What? You speak like an educated man. You have skills that could take you anywhere in the territory. Why do you stay in a place that treats you like an outcast? Joseph was quiet for so long that Martha thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft as leather. My mother is buried here, on the ridge where I keep watch. It is Apache ground, sacred to her people. But the army didn't care about that when they drove them out. He looked toward the darkened window. I am the only one left who remembers her stories, who can speak her language. If I leave, she dies completely. The raw pain in his words made Martha's chest tight. What was her name? Bright Hawk Woman. She was captured by raiders when she was 16, sold to the cavalry as a translator. My father, Captain Robert Crow Feather, treated her with kindness when others saw only a savage. She fell in love with his gentleness. He fell in love with her strength. A love story. Of sorts. They had 5 good years before the influenza took her. My father tried to raise me properly, but he was killed at Gettysburg when I was 12. After that, Joseph shrugged. I belonged nowhere. Martha set down the bottle of carbolic acid with careful precision. You belong wherever you choose to make your stand. Their eyes met across the lamplight, and something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or recognition of kindred souls. Then Joseph rose, reaching for his coat. I should go. If someone sees me here, then they'll see a man leaving after receiving medical treatment, Martha said firmly. Nothing more, nothing less. But they both knew it was already more than that. The town meeting was called for the following Saturday, and Martha knew she was the topic of discussion before she even walked through the church doors. Conversations died as she entered, replaced by hostile stares and whispered judgments. Martha took a seat in the back row, spine straight and chin raised, refusing to show the fear that gnawed at her stomach. Walter Hayes stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Beside him sat the other school board members, Dr. Kellerman with his red-veined nose, Merchant Tom Henderson wringing his hands nervously, and cattle rancher Big Jim Watson, whose scowl could sour milk at 50 paces. Ladies and gentlemen, Hayes began, his voice carrying the false gravity of a man who enjoyed wielding power over others. We're here today to address a matter of grave concern regarding our children's moral education. Martha's hands clenched in her lap as Hayes launched into his prepared speech about appropriate standards and community values. She'd heard it all before, thinly veiled racism dressed up in respectable language. Miss Sinclair has been observed consorting with the half-breed Apache Joe, Hayes continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. This behavior sets an unacceptable example for our impressionable young people. What exactly has she done wrong? The voice came from the middle of the congregation, Sheriff Morrison, standing with his arms crossed and his face set in hard lines. Hayes faltered slightly. Well, she's been seen talking to him, meeting with him in private. She asked him to help find my daughter, Morrison interrupted. And because of that, Sally is alive today instead of dead at the bottom of a mine shaft. I'd say that shows excellent judgment." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some agreeing, others voicing protest. Hayes raised his hand for silence. "Be that as it may, Sheriff, recent events have raised questions about Miss Sinclair's discretion. Mrs. Henderson saw the Indian leaving her room late at night just 2 days ago." The accusation hit the room like a thunderclap. Martha felt every eye turn toward her, judgment written in their expressions. Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously from her seat near the front, clearly relishing her moment of importance. "Is this true, Miss Sinclair?" Hayes asked with false concern. "Did you entertain the Apache in your private quarters after dark?" Martha rose slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I treated a serious snake bite that was becoming infected. Mr. Crow Feather could have lost his arm or his life without proper medical attention." "How convenient," sneered Big Jim Watson. "And I suppose you're the only person in town capable of such treatment." "I'm the only person in town willing to treat him," Martha replied coldly. "Dr. Kellerman has made his position on serving Indians quite clear." Dr. Kellerman's face flushed red, but he didn't deny the accusation. Martha pressed on, anger giving her courage. "A man was wounded and needed help. I gave it. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, perhaps you should examine your consciences instead of my character." "Character?" Hayes laughed harshly. "You speak of character while cavorting with savages? While exposing yourself to God knows what diseases and depravities? That's enough." The new voice came from the doorway, where Joseph Crow Feather stood silhouetted against the afternoon light. The church erupted in chaos as Joseph walked down the center aisle, his movements calm and deliberate despite the hostile faces surrounding him. Some women actually drew back, as if his mere presence might contaminate them. "You have something to say about Miss Sinclair's character?" Joseph asked Hayes, his voice carrying deadly quiet. "Then say it to me." Hayes's bravado cracked slightly. "This is a private meeting. You have no business here." "I have business anywhere my name is spoken," Joseph replied. "And since you seem so interested in the truth, let me provide it." He turned to face the congregation, and Martha was struck by his dignity in the face of their naked hatred. "Miss Sinclair saved my life," he said simply. "I was bitten by a prairie rattler 3 days ago. The wound was infected and I was too proud to seek help. She insisted on treating it, despite knowing what it might cost her." Joseph's dark eyes found Martha's across the crowded room. She acted with compassion and skill, asking nothing in return. "If that is not Christian behavior, then I misunderstand your religion." "We don't need lectures on Christianity from heathens," Big Jim Watson snarled. "Perhaps not," Joseph agreed, "but you might benefit from observing it in action." He looked back at Hayes. "Miss Sinclair is the finest teacher these children will ever have. If you drive her away because she showed mercy to someone you consider beneath you, then you are fools as well as bigots." The silence that followed Joseph's words stretched taut as a bowstring until it snapped under the weight of Big Jim Watson's fury. "How dare you come into our church and lecture us?" Watson roared, surging to his feet. "You got some nerve for a half-breed mongrel who ain't wanted here." Joseph didn't flinch, but Martha saw his hand drift slightly toward the knife at his belt. "I go where I please, Watson. This is still Apache land, no matter what your government papers claim." "Apache land?" Hayes laughed shrilly. "The Apache are gone, driven out where they belong. You're just a leftover, too stupid to follow them." "Enough!" Sheriff Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Watson, sit down before I arrest you for disturbing the peace. Hayes, you've said your piece. Now let's vote and be done with this." But Martha had heard enough. She stood, her legs unsteady, but her voice clear. "There's no need for a vote, gentlemen. I resign." Gasps echoed through the church. Joseph's dark eyes snapped to her face, and she saw something that might have been pain flicker in their depths. "Miss Sinclair," Sheriff Morrison said urgently, "don't be hasty. There are people here who support you." "A few, perhaps," Martha replied, "but not enough. I won't teach children whose parents believe compassion is a sin and helping others is immoral." She looked directly at Hayes. "I'll be gone by tomorrow's stage." She walked toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster, aware of Joseph falling into step beside her. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, some with relief, others with what might have been shame. Outside, the desert wind whipped Martha's skirts around her ankles as she fought back tears of rage and despair. Where would she go now? What would she do? "Martha." Joseph's voice was soft behind her. She turned, and the understanding in his dark eyes nearly broke her composure completely. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know what this place means to you, being near your mother's grave. If I hadn't interfered. You saved my life. Nothing else matters. Everything matters." The words burst out of her like water from a broken dam. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no prospects. I'm 42 years old and completely alone in the world. I'll probably end up in some charity house taking in laundry until I die of consumption in a cold room somewhere." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those penetrating eyes. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "There is another option." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What?" "My camp is in the foothills, near my mother's grave. It's rough living, but there's a cabin, something my father built years ago when he was courting her. It needs work, but it's sturdy." Joseph paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You could stay there, until you decide what comes next." The offer hung between them like a bridge over a chasm. Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she considered the implications. "People would assume," she began. "People assume the worst regardless," Joseph replied. "At least this way you would have shelter and safety while you make plans. I couldn't pay you anything. I have barely enough money for stage fare to Santa Fe. I ask for no payment." Martha studied his face, searching for ulterior motives and finding none. Just quiet honesty and something else, loneliness that matched her own. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you help me when it would only bring you more trouble?" Joseph's smile was sad and beautiful. "Because in 3 years, you are the only person who has treated me like a human being. Because you risked everything to save my life, and I would do no less for you." He paused, looking out at the desert that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. "And because we are both alone in the world. Perhaps that is burden enough without adding unnecessary pride to it." The practical part of Martha's mind screamed warnings about reputation and propriety and all the ways this could end in disaster. But the practical part of her mind had led her to this forsaken town in the first place, teaching children whose parents viewed her as a necessary evil. Maybe it was time to stop being practical. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you." Something flickered in Joseph's eyes, relief, perhaps, or gratitude. "You won't regret this decision, Martha. I give you my word." "I hope not," Martha murmured, looking back at the church where the town meeting was probably still raging. "Because I just burned every bridge I had left." The cabin sat in a grove of cottonwoods beside a small spring, its log walls weathered but solid against the backdrop of red rock cliffs. Martha climbed down from Joseph's horse and stood in the dappled sunlight, taking in her new surroundings with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. The building was larger than she'd expected. 2 rooms with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced east toward the valley below. "My father built it for my mother," Joseph explained, dismounting and gathering their supplies. She never lived to see it finished, but he completed it anyway, said it was his way of honoring her memory. Martha walked up the steps, her boots echoing on the weathered planks. The door stood slightly ajar, and she could see dust motes dancing in the slanted light that filtered through grimy windows. "No one's lived here for years," Joseph continued, following her onto the porch. "I use it sometimes when the weather turns bad, but mostly I camp by my mother's gravesite." The interior was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with built-in shelves on either side. A rough table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room, while a doorway led to what appeared to be a small bedroom. "It's beautiful," Martha said softly, running her fingers along the smooth log walls. "Your father was a skilled craftsman. He learned from watching my mother's people. Apache builders know how to work with the land instead of against it." Joseph set down her trunk and satchel near the door. "The spring provides fresh water year-round, and there's a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin." Martha walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful valley below. In the distance, she could see Copper Ridge like a collection of child's blocks scattered in the desert. From here, the town's ugliness was hidden by distance and golden light. "Where do you usually sleep?" she asked, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. "There's a lean-to on the north side where I keep my gear, and often I sleep under the stars by my mother's grave." Joseph moved to the fireplace, checking the flue. "You'll have the cabin to yourself, Martha. I want you to feel safe here." "I do feel safe," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Safer than I've felt since leaving Boston." Joseph began building a fire with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure. "There's dried meat and cornmeal in the root cellar, enough to last several weeks. I hunt regularly, so fresh meat won't be a problem." "I can cook," Martha offered. "It's one skill I managed to perfect during my marriage." Thomas was a fortunate man. The simple words, spoken without looking at her, made Martha's chest tight. I was the fortunate one. As the fire caught and began to warm the cabin, Martha found herself studying Joseph's profile in the flickering light. Strong features, weathered by sun and wind, but still handsome in a rugged way. There was something almost scholarly about the careful way he spoke, the precision of his movements. "Joseph," she said suddenly, "how much schooling did you have?" He looked up from the fire, surprise flickering across his features. "My father insisted on education. He said knowledge was the only thing no one could take away from me." Joseph straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "I attended the territorial school in Tucson until I was 16. After that, I read everything I could find." "What kind of books?" "Poetry, mostly. Shakespeare, Wordsworth, some Walt Whitman." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "My mother used to tell stories about Coyote and Raven. My father read me Hamlet and King Lear. It made for an interesting childhood." Martha found herself smiling back. "I would imagine so. Do you still have any of those books?" "A few, hidden in the lean-to along with my other treasures." Joseph's expression grew serious. "Martha, there's something you should know about living here. We're isolated, but we're not completely cut off from the world. Occasionally, travelers pass through, and some of them aren't friendly." "What kind of travelers?" "Drifters, mostly. Some outlaws fleeing the law. A few prospectors heading into the mountains." Joseph moved to check the window latches, his movements suddenly tense. "Most leave us alone, but it's important that you understand the risks." "Are you trying to frighten me away?" "I'm trying to be honest with you. Life out here isn't like your civilized Boston. There are real dangers." Martha lifted her chin, the same gesture that had served her well in Copper Ridge. I survived a cholera epidemic, a house fire, and 2 years of creditors trying to steal everything I owned. I think I can handle a few desert wanderers." Joseph turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd met him, he laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his entire face. "You are remarkable, Martha Sinclair. Most women would be demanding I take them back to town immediately. Most women haven't spent the last 2 years learning that respectability is just another word for cowardice," Martha replied. "Besides, where would I go? Back to Copper Ridge to face Hayes's smug satisfaction? On to Santa Fe with no money and no prospects?" She moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the desert landscape painted gold by the setting sun. "At least here I can live with dignity. That's more than I had in that miserable town. And what will you do with your days?" The question caught Martha off guard. In Boston, every moment had been scheduled. Teaching, housework, caring for Thomas during his illness, then the endless struggle with lawyers and creditors after his death. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had the luxury of choosing how to spend her time. "I don't know," she admitted. "Read, I suppose. Explore. Maybe start a garden by the spring." "There are Indian ruins in the cliffs above us," Joseph offered. "My mother's people considered this place sacred. There are stories written in the rocks, if you know how to read them. Would you teach me?" The words slipped out before Martha could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. But Joseph didn't seem to find the request inappropriate. "I would be honored to," he said quietly. "It's been a long time since I had someone to share my mother's stories with." As full darkness settled over the canyon, they shared a simple meal of cornbread and dried meat, talking quietly by the fire. Martha found herself relaxing for the first time in months, lulled by the crackle of flames and the comforting presence of someone who understood loneliness. When she finally retired to the small bedroom, he lay awake listening to the night sounds of the desert, coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the soft murmur of Joseph's voice as he spoke to his horse. For the first time since Thomas's death, Martha fell asleep without crying. The sound of gunshots jerked Martha from sleep 3 weeks later, her heart hammering as she struggled to orient herself in the pre-dawn darkness. Through the bedroom window, she could see muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies in the canyon below. Joseph's voice, sharp with authority, cut through the chaos. "That's far enough, boys. Turn around and ride out while you still can." Martha grabbed her robe and crept to the main room, peering through the front window. 4 men on horseback had Joseph surrounded near the spring, their weapons drawn. Even in the dim light, she could see they were a rough bunch, unshaven, trail dirty, with the predatory alertness of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Well, well," drawled the apparent leader, a big man with a Confederate cavalry hat. "Apache Joe and his white squaw. Heard tell you folks been living up here all cozy-like." "The woman is under my protection," Joseph replied, his rifle steady despite being outnumbered 4-1. "Harm her, and you'll answer to me." The leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You hear that, boys? The breed thinks he can threaten white men." His voice turned ugly. "We ain't here for threats, Indian. We're here for supplies, fresh horses, and whatever else we can find." "You'll find nothing here but trouble," Joseph said calmly. "Ride on." Martha's hands shook as she watched the deadly tableau unfold. The outlaws were spreading out, trying to surround Joseph completely. In moments, they'd have him in a crossfire with no chance of escape. Moving carefully, Martha crept to her trunk and pulled out Thomas's service revolver, a memento from his brief stint as an army surgeon during the war. She'd never fired it, but Thomas had insisted she learn to load and aim properly. "You got spirit, breed," the leader was saying as Martha eased the front door open. "But 4 against 1 ain't sporting odds. Tell you what, give us the woman for an hour or two, and we might let you live." "Over my dead body," Joseph snarled, and Martha heard the sound of hammers being cocked. "That can be arranged," the leader replied. Martha stepped onto the porch, the revolver heavy in her hands. "Gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I believe you're trespassing." All 5 men turned toward her, and Martha was gratified to see surprise and uncertainty flicker across the outlaws' faces. She'd taken care to position herself in the shadows of the porch, making herself a difficult target. "Well, hello there, darling," the leader said with false joviality. "Why don't you come down here and join the party?" "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you." Martha kept her voice steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "In fact, I have an excellent view of all 4 of you from here. And this rifle has an excellent range." It was a bluff. The revolver's range was limited, but the outlaws didn't know that. She saw them exchange uncertain glances. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, lady," one of them called out. "We just want supplies and horses. Nobody has to get hurt." "I'm afraid I disagree," Martha replied. "You see, this is our home, and we take a dim view of uninvited guests who arrive with guns drawn." The leader's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Enough of this. Boys, take the breed, I'll handle the woman." "I wouldn't advise that," Martha said coolly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder in the canyon, and the leader's hat went flying. The outlaws' horses reared and shied, throwing their carefully planned positions into chaos. Joseph moved like lightning, using the distraction to dive behind a boulder near the spring. His rifle barked twice in rapid succession, and 2 of the outlaws cried out, clutching wounded arms. "The woman's got teeth," one of them yelled. "This ain't worth it, Caleb." "Like hell it ain't," the leader snarled, wheeling his horse toward the cabin. "I'll drag that hellcat down here by her hair." Martha's second shot took his horse in the shoulder, sending both animal and rider crashing to the ground. The leader rolled free, cursing viciously, his gun coming up toward the porch. Joseph's rifle boomed again, and the man's weapon spun away into the darkness. "Next one goes through your heart, Caleb," Joseph called out. "Your choice." For a long moment, the canyon hung in deadly silence. Then the leader slowly raised his hands. "All right, Breed, you win this round." He gestured to his men. "Boys, mount up. We're riding out." "And Caleb?" Joseph's voice was soft as silk. "If I see you in this canyon again, I'll kill you on sight. Pass that word to anyone else who might be interested." The outlaws gathered their wounded and rode out cursing, their pride as damaged as their bodies. Martha stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then her legs gave out, and she sank onto the wooden steps. Joseph appeared beside her moments later, gently taking the revolver from her trembling hands. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You saved mine first," Martha managed through chattering teeth. "Fair's fair." Joseph sat beside her on the steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Thomas taught me. He said a woman alone needed to know how to protect herself." Martha looked at the smoking revolver in Joseph's hands. "I never thought I'd actually use it." "You did well. Cool head, steady hands, perfect timing." Joseph's dark eyes found hers in the growing dawn light. "Most people freeze up in their first gunfight." "I was terrified," Martha admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you act despite the fear." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun crested the canyon rim, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. Martha found herself studying Joseph's profile, noting the way the light caught the strong line of his jaw, the proud curve of his nose. "Joseph," she said suddenly, "what you said to those men about me being under your protection, did you mean it?" He turned to look at her, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. Every word. Even though it could bring you more trouble? Especially because of that. Joseph's voice was soft but certain. You've given me more than shelter and medical care, Martha. You've given me friendship, trust, a reason to believe that not all human connection ends in betrayal. Martha felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. Joseph, don't, he said gently. Don't say anything you might regret later. We've both been through enough loss for one lifetime. But as they sat together on the porch of the cabin his father had built for love, Martha wondered if it was possible to be too careful with the heart, too protective of something that was meant to be shared. The letter arrived 2 months later, carried by a Navajo trader who'd heard there was a white woman living in the canyon. Martha read it twice before the words sank in, her hands trembling as she held the official-looking document. Joseph looked up from sharpening his knife, noting her pale complexion. Bad news? My sister Elizabeth, Martha said faintly. She's found me. The letter was brief and to the point, written in Elizabeth's familiar, precise handwriting. Dearest Martha, I have finally tracked you to that God-forsaken territory through inquiries with the Boston Ladies' Aid Society. Word has reached Boston of your situation with a half-breed Indian. I am departing immediately for Arizona to rescue you from this degradation. Expect me within the month. Your loving sister, Elizabeth Whitmore. Martha sank into one of the chairs by the fireplace, the letter fluttering to the floor. Joseph bent to retrieve it, his eyes scanning the contents with growing concern. She's coming here? She thinks she's rescuing me, Martha said with bitter laughter. Elizabeth always did believe she knew what was best for everyone. Joseph set the letter on the table, his expression troubled. What will you tell her? The truth. That I'm happy here. That I've found peace for the first time since Thomas died. Martha looked around the cabin that had become home over the past months. Though I doubt she'll understand. And if she doesn't? If she insists you return to Boston with her? The question hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Martha had no ready answer because she hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. Living day to day in the canyon had become a kind of meditation, tending her garden, learning Apache stories from Joseph, finding contentment in simple routines. But Elizabeth's letter forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She was a 42-year-old widow living alone with a man in the Arizona wilderness. By society's standards, she was ruined beyond redemption. I won't go back, she said finally. I can't. Even if staying means losing your family forever? Martha met his dark eyes across the small room. Elizabeth is my only living relative, and we've never been close. She disapproved of my marriage to Thomas because he was beneath my station, the younger son of a poor Irish family instead of proper Boston nobility. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful canyon where she'd found something approaching happiness. I spent 18 years defending my choices to Elizabeth. I won't spend whatever years I have left doing the same thing. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. What if she's right? What if you deserve better than this isolated life with a half-breed outcast? Martha spun around, anger flashing in her green eyes. Don't you dare. Don't you dare let her poison reach you before she even arrives. I'm trying to be realistic, Martha. You had a life in Boston. Culture, society, opportunity. Here, you have nothing but wilderness and the company of a man most people consider savage. Here, I have peace, Martha said fiercely. Here I have respect and friendship and meaningful work. I have someone who talks to me like I have a brain instead of treating me like a decorative ornament." She moved toward him, her voice rising with passion. "Do you know what my life was like after Thomas died? Elizabeth and her friends hovering around me like vultures, making plans for my future without consulting me. They wanted to marry me off to some appropriate widower who needed a housekeeper and social hostess." Joseph's hands stilled on his knife. "They meant well." "They meant to dispose of me conveniently," Martha corrected. "A 40-year-old widow with no children and no fortune isn't exactly a prize on the marriage market. They just wanted me settled somewhere so they could stop feeling guilty about my situation." She reached out without thinking, covering his hands with hers. "You've never treated me like a burden or a problem to be solved. You've treated me like a person worthy of respect and consideration. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Joseph looked down at their joined hands, something painful flickering across his features. "Martha." "No, let me finish." Her voice gentled, but her grip on his hands remained firm. "I know what people see when they look at us. I know what Elizabeth will see when she arrives. But they don't understand what we've built here." "What have we built?" Joseph asked quietly. "Partnership, trust, a life based on mutual respect instead of social convention." Martha paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "And friendship that feels like it could become something deeper if we were brave enough to let it." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Joseph's dark eyes searched her face, looking for uncertainty and finding none. "Your sister will try to convince you that I'm taking advantage of your vulnerable state," he said finally. "She'll say I'm a predator who's isolated you from civilization to make you dependent on me. And what would you say to that?" Joseph's smile was sad and beautiful. "I'd say she's partially right. I am selfish enough to hope you choose to stay, even knowing you might be happier elsewhere." "Then we're both selfish," Martha said softly, "because I've been hoping the same thing." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them, hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls in the late afternoon stillness. Joseph released Martha's hands and moved to the window, his body tense with alertness. "3 riders," he reported. "Well-dressed, expensive horses. Probably not outlaws." Martha's heart sank as she recognized the ramrod-straight posture of the lead rider. "It's Elizabeth. She made better time than expected." Joseph checked his rifle, though he kept it low and non-threatening. "Are you ready for this?" Martha smoothed her skirts and checked her hair in the small mirror by the door. After months of simple living, she knew she looked different, tanned from working in the garden, leaner from the physical demands of canyon life, more alive than she'd felt in years. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, then met Joseph's eyes with quiet determination. "Whatever happens, Joseph, I want you to know I don't regret a single day we've spent here together." "Nor do I," he replied. "Whatever comes next." Elizabeth Whitmore dismounted her horse with the imperious grace of a woman accustomed to commanding attention, her traveling dress immaculate despite the long journey from town. She was everything Martha remembered, tall, elegant, with silver-threaded brown hair swept into a perfect chignon, and intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing. Behind her rode 2 men, a well-dressed gentleman Martha didn't recognize and a rough-looking guide who was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Martha Catherine Sinclair," Elizabeth said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent her life organizing charity committees and managing servants. "What in heaven's name have you done to yourself?" Martha stepped off the porch to meet her sister, acutely aware of her simple cotton dress and sun-darkened skin. "Hello, Elizabeth. You look well." "I look civilized," Elizabeth replied tartly, her gaze sweeping over the cabin and settling with obvious distaste on Joseph, who stood quietly in the shadows of the porch. "Which is more than I can say for my younger sister." The well-dressed gentleman dismounted and approached with a polite smile. "Miss Sinclair, I presume? I'm Dr. Philip Hartwell, a colleague of your late husband's from Boston. Your sister asked me to accompany her on this rescue mission." "Rescue mission?" Martha felt her temper beginning to simmer. "I wasn't aware I needed rescuing." "Look at yourself," Elizabeth said bluntly. "Living in squalor with a savage, cut off from civilization and decent society. If this isn't cause for rescue, I don't know what is." Joseph stepped forward, his movement fluid but non-threatening. "Ma'am, I'm Joseph Crowfeather. Your sister has been my guest, not my prisoner. She's free to leave any time she chooses." Elizabeth's eyes raked over him with undisguised revulsion. "I wasn't addressing you, Indian. In fact, I'd prefer if you didn't speak at all." "Elizabeth," Martha's voice cracked like a whip. "Joseph is my friend, and this is his property. You'll show him respect, or you can turn around and ride back to whatever rock you crawled out from under." Shocked silence followed Martha's outburst. The guide shifted nervously in his saddle, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Dr. Hartwell looked between the sisters with the expression of a man who'd stumbled into a family feud. Elizabeth's face had gone rigid with disapproval. "My goodness, Martha, you really have gone native, haven't you? Using that tone with me, defending this person." "This person saved my life," Martha said coldly. "More than once, which is more than I can say for my dear sister, who couldn't be bothered to visit when I was losing everything in Boston. I wrote letters. You wrote lectures about accepting God's will and making the best of my situation. Very helpful when the creditors were taking our furniture." Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside. The journey has been long, and I'm sure we're all tired." Martha wanted to refuse, to send them away before they could contaminate the peace she'd found. But breeding and basic courtesy won out. "Of course, Joseph. Would you help with their horses?" As they settled around the rough table inside the cabin, Martha served coffee with hands that shook only slightly. Elizabeth's sharp eyes catalogued every detail, the simple furnishings, the worn but clean conditions, the obvious care that had gone into making the space comfortable. "How long have you been living in this arrangement?" Dr. Hartwell asked delicately. 3 months, Martha replied. "The most peaceful 3 months I've had since Thomas died." "Peaceful?" Elizabeth laughed harshly. "Martha, you're living in sin with a half-breed Indian in the middle of nowhere. How can you call that peaceful?" "Because no one here judges me for helping a wounded man or expects me to apologize for my choices," Martha shot back. "Because I'm treated like an intelligent adult instead of a child who can't manage her own life." Joseph, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, your sister has been nothing but honorable during her time here. If you're suggesting otherwise—" "I'm suggesting," Elizabeth interrupted, "that a decent woman doesn't run off to live alone with a man, regardless of the circumstances. The scandal alone—" "What scandal?" Martha demanded. "Among whom? The charming citizens of Copper Ridge who accused me of consorting with savages for giving medical aid, or the Boston Society matrons who wrote me off the moment Thomas died because I wasn't wealthy enough to be worth their attention anymore?" Dr. Hartwell set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "Miss Sinclair, surely you understand your sister's concerns, your reputation." "My reputation died with my husband," Martha said flatly. "What little the creditors left of it anyway." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the canyon that had become her sanctuary. I've spent the last 2 years trying to rebuild my life according to other people's expectations, following their rules, accepting their limitations, apologizing for existing. Martha turned back to face her sister, her chin raised defiantly. I won't do it anymore, Elizabeth. I won't go back to Boston to waste away in some genteel poverty while you and your friends cluck their tongues about poor Martha and her tragic circumstances. So instead you'll waste away here? Elizabeth's voice rose with frustration. In the wilderness, with a man who can offer you nothing but isolation and shame. He's offered me respect, Martha said quietly. Friendship, safety, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms instead of society's. And what happens when you're too old to fetch water from that spring? When you need medical care or comfort in your final years? What happens when he decides he's tired of playing house with an aging white woman? The cruel words hit their mark, and Martha flinched. But it was Joseph who responded, his voice deadly quiet. Ma'am, your sister has given me more kindness and consideration than I've received from any white person in my life. If you think I would ever harm or abandon her, then you understand neither honor nor loyalty. Don't lecture me about honor, Indian, Elizabeth snapped. I know what your kind thinks of white women. Joseph stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his knife. Martha quickly stepped between them, her heart pounding. That's enough, she said firmly. Elizabeth, you've insulted my friend, and my choices quite enough for one day. Joseph, please don't give her the satisfaction of proving her wrong about you. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Dr. Hartwell looked distinctly uncomfortable, while the guide had wisely remained outside with the horses. Martha, Elizabeth said, her voice tight with controlled anger, I'm going to ask you one more time. Will you come home with me, back to civilization and decent society? I've arranged a position for you as a governess with the Aldrich family. Good wages, respectable work, your own room in a proper household. A governess? Martha felt her last thread of patience snap. You want me to spend my remaining years raising other people's children, sleeping in a servant's room, grateful for whatever scraps of respect they toss my way? It's honest work, Elizabeth said defensively. Respectable work. So is what I'm doing here, Martha replied. I tend my garden, help Joseph with hunting and preserving food, share knowledge and stories. We've created a life based on mutual respect and partnership. If that's not respectable, then respectability isn't worth having. Dr. Hartwell leaned forward. Miss Sinclair, perhaps you'd benefit from a woman's perspective. Your sister is concerned about your spiritual welfare as well as your physical safety. Living in sin? We're not living in sin, Martha interrupted. We're living as friends and companions, nothing more. But even as she said it, Martha knew it wasn't entirely true anymore. Something had been growing between her and Joseph over the past months, something deeper than friendship, but not yet named. The thought of leaving him, of returning to the cold emptiness of her previous life, made her chest tight with panic. Yet, Elizabeth said shrewdly, noting her sister's expression, but for how long, Martha? How long before loneliness and proximity lead to something you'll regret? I regret nothing about my time here, Martha said firmly. Nothing. Elizabeth stood, her face set in lines of grim determination. Then you leave me no choice. Martha, I'm invoking the power of Attorney Thomas granted our family before his death. You're coming back to Boston whether you want to or not. The words hit Martha like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her swaying on her feet. You can't do that, she whispered. Thomas is dead. Any power of attorney died with him. Dr. Hartwell reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. I'm afraid not, Miss Sinclair. As a physician, I was asked to review your husband's final arrangements. This document grants your family the authority to make decisions regarding your welfare should you be deemed mentally incompetent or under undue influence. Martha's hands shook as she took the papers, scanning the legal language that might as well have been written in Sanskrit. But she could make out enough to see Thomas's signature at the bottom, alongside that of his lawyer and 2 witnesses. "Thomas would never have agreed to this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was dying, Martha," Elizabeth said with false gentleness. "He was worried about leaving you alone in the world with no family to protect you. The power of attorney was meant to ensure your safety." Joseph moved closer, his dark eyes scanning the documents over Martha's shoulder. "What exactly does this mean?" "It means," Dr. Hartwell said carefully, "that if Miss Sinclair is judged to be in a situation detrimental to her physical or mental health, her family has the legal authority to remove her from that situation." "By force?" Joseph's voice was deadly quiet. "If necessary." Elizabeth's chin rose defiantly. "Martha is clearly not in her right mind, living out here like a savage with a person like you. The isolation has affected her judgment." Martha felt the walls of the cabin closing in around her, the familiar sensation of being trapped by other people's decisions about her life. "I won't go," she said desperately. "I'm not incompetent, and I'm certainly not under any undue influence." "Aren't you?" Dr. Hartwell's voice was professionally sympathetic. "Miss Sinclair, you've abandoned civilized society to live alone with a man of questionable character in the wilderness. You've isolated yourself from family and friends. These are classic signs of diminished capacity, or signs of a woman finally making her own choices," Martha shot back. "What choices?" Elizabeth demanded. "You had no money, no prospects, no options when you left Boston. This Indian simply took advantage of your desperate situation." Joseph stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "Ma'am, I've listened to your insults and accusations long enough. Your sister sought me out, not the other way around. She's free to leave any time she chooses." "Is she?" Dr. Hartwell asked pointedly. "Miss Sinclair, do you have money for transportation? Anywhere to go if you leave here? Any means of supporting yourself?" The questions hit home, because Martha knew the answers. She had perhaps $20 left to her name, no prospects for employment, and nowhere to go except back to the poverty and dependence she'd fled. "I'll manage," she said weakly. "How?" Elizabeth pressed. "By depending on his charity? That's not independence, Martha. That's just a different kind of imprisonment." Martha looked around the cabin that had become her refuge, seeing it suddenly through her sister's eyes. Simple to the point of primitiveness, isolated, dependent on the kindness of a man society considered barely civilized. But then her gaze fell on small details that Elizabeth had missed. The careful way Joseph had repaired the roof where it leaked above her bed, the wild flowers he brought her each morning from his walks, the way he'd never once made her feel like a burden or obligation. "Joseph," she said quietly, "what happens if I stay and they try to take me by force?" His jaw tightened. "They won't take you anywhere you don't want to go. I give you my word." "And if that means fighting, bloodshed?" Joseph's dark eyes met hers steadily. "If necessary." Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Sinclair, surely you don't want to be responsible for violence. Your sister has arranged comfortable accommodations, respectable work." "A cage," Martha interrupted. "A comfortable, respectable cage." "Better than this hovel," Elizabeth snapped. Martha walked to the fireplace, running her hands along the smooth stone Joseph's father had laid with his own hands. Elizabeth, do you remember what you said to me after Thomas's funeral? I said many things. I was trying to comfort you. You said I was lucky to have had love at all, that some women go their whole lives without ever knowing what it feels like to be truly cherished. Martha turned to face her sister. I found that love again here. Not romantic love, not yet, but something deeper. Respect, partnership, the knowledge that someone sees value in me beyond my usefulness to them. You're deluding yourself, Elizabeth said harshly. This man wants one thing from you, and once he gets it. What I want, Joseph said quietly, is for Martha to be happy. If going with you would make her happy, I'd help her pack myself. And if she stays? Joseph looked at Martha, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in his dark eyes. Then I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of her choice. Dr. Hartwell consulted his pocket watch. Miss Sinclair, we need to depart soon if we're to reach town before nightfall. What's your decision? Martha felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. On one side stood her sister, representing safety, respectability, and everything she'd been taught to value. On the other stood Joseph, representing uncertainty, social ruin, and the kind of deep contentment she'd thought lost forever. I need a moment alone, she said finally, to think. Elizabeth started to protest, but Dr. Hartwell laid a restraining hand on her arm. Of course. We'll wait outside. As the others filed out, leaving Martha alone with Joseph, she felt the weight of the decision crushing down on her. I don't know what to do, she whispered, sinking into one of the chairs by the fireplace. Joseph knelt beside her, his calloused hands gentle as they covered hers. Martha, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing her own fear and uncertainty reflected in their dark depths. What does your heart tell you? He asked softly. My heart tells me to stay, but my head... Martha's voice broke. Joseph, what if Elizabeth is right? What if I'm just fooling myself about what we have here? What if you grow tired of me or I become a burden as I age? And what if you go back to Boston and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Joseph countered. What if you waste away in some rich family's house, teaching their children while your own heart dies a little more each day? Martha studied his face, seeing the quiet desperation he was trying to hide. You want me to stay? More than I've ever wanted anything, he admitted. But I want you to stay because it's what you want, not because you're afraid of the alternative. I am afraid, Martha confessed. Terrified, actually, of making the wrong choice, of hurting you, of destroying what little reputation I have left. Joseph's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. Fear is natural, but regret is what kills the soul. Through the window, Martha could see Elizabeth pacing impatiently beside the horses, Dr. Hartwell checking his pocket watch again. In a few moments they would demand her decision, and she would have to choose between the safety of the known and the uncertainty of the heart. Joseph, she said suddenly, if I stay, what are we to each other? What does this become? For a long moment he was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever you want it to become, Martha. I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to share the sunset with. Someone who laughed at my stories and trusted me with their fears. His dark eyes searched her face. If friendship is all you can offer, I'll treasure it. If you can give me more, I'll spend my life trying to deserve it. The raw honesty in his words nearly broke her heart. And if the townspeople come after us, if there's violence, then we'll face it together. Joseph's jaw tightened with determination. I won't let anyone hurt you, Martha. Not Hayes, not outlaws, not even your well-meaning sister." Martha looked around the cabin one more time, seeing not its simplicity but its possibilities. She thought of her garden growing green beside the spring, of the Apache stories Joseph shared on quiet evenings, of the peace she'd found in work that mattered, and a companion who valued her mind as much as her domestic skills. Then she thought of the Aldrich family's house in Boston, of sleeping in a servant's room and raising children who would never truly be hers, of growing old gracefully and quietly and utterly alone. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Martha stood and walked to the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. Elizabeth looked up expectantly as Martha emerged onto the porch, Dr. Hartwell and the guide gathering around with obvious anticipation. "Well?" Elizabeth demanded. "Have you come to your senses?" "Yes," Martha said calmly. "I have." Relief flooded Elizabeth's face. "Thank God. Dr. Hartwell, help her gather her things. We can make town before—" "I'm staying," Martha said clearly. The words hit the group like a thunderbolt. Elizabeth's face went white, then flushed red with anger. "You can't be serious. I have the legal authority to remove me if I'm mentally incompetent or under undue influence," Martha interrupted. "But I'm neither. I'm a grown woman making a reasoned decision about my own life." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward. "Miss Sinclair, surely you realize the implications of your choice. The scandal, the isolation, the freedom," Martha corrected. "The chance to live according to my own values instead of society's expectations." "This is madness," Elizabeth snapped. "Martha, I'm your sister. I know what's best for you." "No, Elizabeth. You know what's most convenient for you." Martha's voice was steady, but Joseph could hear the steel beneath the silk. "You want me safely tucked away where you don't have to worry about my unconventional choices reflecting badly on your social standing." "How dare you?" "How dare I what? Tell the truth?" Martha stepped closer to her sister. "You didn't come here to rescue me, Elizabeth. You came here to manage me, to clean up the embarrassment of having a sister who refuses to follow the proper script for widowhood." Joseph moved to stand beside Martha, his presence a silent show of support. Elizabeth's gaze flickered between them, her expression twisting with disgust. "I see how it is," she said coldly. "You've already given yourself to him, haven't you? Like some common frontier whore." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Joseph's hand moved toward his knife, but Martha's voice cut through the tension. "Get off this property," she said quietly. "Now." "Martha, now!" The word cracked like a gunshot. "You've shown your true colors, Elizabeth. Your concern was never for my welfare. It was for your own reputation." Dr. Hartwell looked deeply uncomfortable. "Miss Sinclair, your sister spoke in anger. Surely you can understand her frustration." "I understand perfectly," Martha replied. "I understand that she sees me as property to be managed rather than a person with the right to choose her own path." Elizabeth drew herself up with wounded dignity. "Fine. Throw your life away on this savage. But don't come crawling back to Boston when he abandons you for some younger squaw." Joseph stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Ma'am, you've insulted Martha for the last time. Mount your horse and ride out, or I'll escort you off this land myself." For a moment, Martha thought Elizabeth might push the confrontation further, but something in Joseph's eyes made her take a step back. "This isn't over," Elizabeth said as she mounted her horse. "I'll contest this in court if I have to. No sister of mine is going to live in sin with an Indian." "Then you'll do it without my cooperation," Martha replied. "Goodbye, Elizabeth." The three visitors rode away in a cloud of dust and anger, leaving Martha and Joseph standing alone on the porch. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Martha felt a strange lightness in her chest, as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been lifted. "Any regrets?" Joseph asked quietly. Martha looked around the canyon that had become her home, breathing in the clean desert air and listening to the peaceful sound of water flowing over stones. "Only one," she said, turning to face him. "What's that?" "That it took me so long to realize what I really wanted." Martha stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Joseph, you asked me what we are to each other, what this becomes." "And?" Martha reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I'd like to find out, if you're willing to take the risk with a stubborn widow who's old enough to know better." Joseph's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Martha Sinclair, I've been waiting my whole life for someone brave enough to take that risk with me." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, while the desert wind sang through the cottonwoods and the afternoon light painted the canyon walls gold. When they finally broke apart, Martha rested her forehead against his, her heart full of possibilities she'd thought lost forever. "I love you, Joseph Crowfeather," she whispered. "And I love you, Martha Sinclair," he replied, "more than words can say." As the sun set over their hidden valley, they stood together on the porch of the cabin built for love, finally ready to claim their own piece of happiness in a world that would never fully understand them. But understanding wasn't necessary. Love was enough. 6 months later, Martha stood in the same spot where she'd first told Joseph she was too old for love, watching him work in the garden they'd expanded together. The seasons had turned, bringing the harsh beauty of winter to their canyon sanctuary. Snow dusted the red rock cliffs, and ice formed delicate crystals along the edges of the spring. But inside the cabin, warmth and contentment reigned. Martha's hands rested on the slight swell of her belly, a miracle she'd thought impossible at 43. The baby would come with the spring wildflowers, a new life born from the love she'd been brave enough to claim. "Any word from town?" Joseph asked, straightening from where he'd been checking the root vegetables they'd stored for winter. "Sheriff Morrison stopped by yesterday while you were hunting," Martha replied, moving to stand beside him. "Elizabeth has given up her legal challenge. Her lawyer told her no court would force a competent adult to leave a stable home." Joseph slipped his arms around her from behind, his hands covering hers on her belly. "And Hayes? Apparently he's decided we're no longer worth his attention. Morrison thinks our domestic arrangement has actually helped his reputation, proves he wasn't entirely wrong about your character." They'd married in a simple Apache ceremony 3 months earlier, witnessed only by the stars and the sacred stones of Joseph's mother's burial ground. It wasn't legal by territorial law, but it was binding in every way that mattered to them. The townspeople of Copper Ridge had eventually accepted their unusual union with the grudging tolerance of people who'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting. Martha taught the children of families brave enough to make the journey to their canyon school, while Joseph's tracking skills were occasionally requested by those willing to swallow their pride for practical help. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but it was theirs. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd gone back to Boston?" Joseph asked, his breath warm against her ear. Martha leaned back against his solid warmth, watching the last light of day paint the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember what you told me about regret being what kills the soul. I refuse to waste time mourning choices I'm grateful I didn't make." Joseph turned her in his arms, his dark eyes serious. "Even when people stare? Even when children point and whisper about the white woman who married the Apache?" "Especially then," Martha said firmly. "Let them stare. Let them whisper. We know what we have here, and it's worth more than all their approval combined." She reached up to trace the beloved lines of his face, still amazed that this strong, gentle man had chosen to build a life with her. Besides, she added with a smile, our child will grow up knowing that love matters more than color, that courage matters more than convention. That's a better legacy than any society man, Sion, could provide. Joseph's smile was radiant as he placed his hand over their unborn child. A little warrior, he said softly, born of two worlds and belonging fully to both. And loved beyond measure, Martha added. As full darkness settled over the canyon, they went inside to the warmth of their home. Martha prepared their evening meal while Joseph read aloud from one of his treasured books. Tonight it was Whitman, whose celebration of the American spirit seemed fitting for their unconventional family. Later, by the fire's dying light, Martha worked on tiny clothes for the baby, while Joseph carved a wooden toy from a piece of cottonwood. The simple domestic scene filled her with contentment deeper than any she'd known, even in her happy marriage to Thomas. This was different, not the passionate romance of youth, but the deep partnership of two souls who'd found each other after learning life's hardest lessons. It was built on respect and shared struggle, seasoned with humor and strengthened by the knowledge that they'd chosen each other despite all the reasons they shouldn't. Martha, Joseph said suddenly, looking up from his carving. Yes? Thank you. For what? For being brave enough to see past what everyone told you I was. For choosing love over safety. For giving me a family I never thought I'd have. Martha set down her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the hearth. Thank you for waiting for me. For seeing something worth loving in a broken-down widow with too much pride and not enough sense. You were never broken, Joseph said softly, just bent by circumstances beyond your control. But even bent, you never broke. That's what I fell in love with first, your strength. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, its voice rising and falling like an ancient song. Inside, two people who'd thought their chances for happiness had passed them by, settled into each other's arms, grateful for the second chance they'd been brave enough to take. Their love story wouldn't be written in the history books or celebrated in fancy drawing rooms, but it would live on in the child who carried both their bloodlines, in the students Martha taught to read and think for themselves, in the small corner of the world they'd made a little kinder through their courage. Sometimes the greatest victories are the quiet ones, the decision to choose love over fear, hope over resignation, authenticity over acceptance. Martha and Joseph had won that victory, and no force on earth could take it from them. As they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying their story into the vast Arizona night where it joined the eternal song of those brave enough to follow their hearts home. Thank you so much for joining me on Martha and Joseph's journey. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to choose love, never too late to be brave, and never too late to write a new chapter in the book of our lives. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts about love that transcends society's boundaries. Please share in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more authentic Wild West romance tales. And remember, the heart knows no age, no color, and no borders when it finds its true home.